Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about the Karlsbad structure in the Queen's Gambit. Queen's Gambit has got lots of structures that can come out of it. This is the Queen's Gambit. Not a real gambit, but we're offering this C pawn to try and distract black's pawn out of the middle of the board. Or white's also hoping that there's no really good way of defending the pawn. But one of the most common ways of doing it, certainly until very recently when it's been replaced by the Slav, was this orthodox defence of the Queen's Gambit declined. Let's follow one of the main lines, not the absolute main line, but main lines, where both sides have got some pieces out and are fighting for the centre. One of the things that you get in the Queen's Gambit fairly often is this tension in the pawn between the pawns in the centre of the board. We're fighting for the centre, both sides, with these pawns, and there's a lot of things that could go on here. White can capture 2 pawns. Black can capture 2 pawns. If white captures, black can capture with a pawn or a knight, or maybe the queen, but let's leave it at that. And white has the same options here. So what could sort of pawn structures might come out of this include, if white swaps, black takes back with a pawn, and we take on this square, we have what's called an isolated queen pawn for black. Are isolated queen pawns good or bad? Yes, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. Depends where your pieces are and how many pieces there are on the board. But that's one structure that you can get out of this opening. Similarly, you could get the same sort of deal going on. Swap, 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 and white gets an isolated queen pawn. Alternatively, particularly if, essentially if black defends the c pawn with b6 and tries to get the bishop out this way, we could have swap, swap, whoops, swap, 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 and we get 2 black pawns side by side sitting on the D and C files. Those are called hanging pawns. They're not quite isolated. They're sort of semi-detached hanging pawns in the middle of the board there. Are they good or bad? Yes, sometimes. Depends where your other pieces are. And many other pawn formations can come out of the Queen's Gambit for either side. And I think that's one of the secrets of the Queen's Gambit decline. Whatever particular virtues that it has, like blocking in this poor old bishop on c8, whatever virtues the Queen's Gambit has, the pawn formation might not be set. And one of the subtleties is trying to place your pieces in such a position that you're ready for whatever change in the pawn structure comes about. Or if you think your opponent's pieces aren't well placed for one particular structure, then changing the structure so that it doesn't suit them. Which is, makes the Queen's Gambit and the Rai Lopez and the Nimzo Indian and several other openings that have this flexible center, unresolved tension in the centre, so popular at Grandmaster level. I mean, they're difficult. Grandmasters want their Grandmaster opponents to make mistakes. These are very rich positions. But if you're white and you're greedy, you might not want so many of the choices to be left to black. So we might want something which is where black has few choices about how things turn out, and the choice of plans is a bit more up to you. And this is where the Karlsbad structure comes in. The Karlsbad structure is in the Queen's Gambit, where we've swapped in the middle. C takes d5, e takes d5, and that's it for the moment. Black won't, I think, want to play c5 as in the previous example, because then they might get left with an isolated queen's pawn under poor circumstances. So this is the pawn formation that black is given and probably is going to have to sit with for a little bit, at least for a while. But white has got a number of plans here that they can adopt, and a number of ways actually of changing the structure, but that's up to white. There are actually 3 half-decent plans here for white. The classic one, which is still very popular and still very often played, is to say, well, we've got a rook on c1, there's the invisible rook, on a half-open file, and that would be very useful, pressurising this pawn Well, it would be if that pawn wasn't very, very solidly defended by this pawn on b7. But can we undermine it in some way? If we send our pawn down the board, our b pawn down the board, and swap and swap, then our rook on c1 is going to be attacking a backward pawn on a half-open file. That's kind of the worst sort of backward pawn you can have, and it's a genuine weakness. And one weakness might not lose you the game. 3 white pieces attack the pawn, 3 black pieces defend it. Kind of, you know, it's might be worse for black. Black's on the defensive, but it's not losing. But if there's a second weakness there, maybe the a pawn is weak, or there's some other weakness on some other part of the board, or if you can get your opponent's pieces to step on each other's toes somehow, then this might not be quite a good way to play for white, and certainly a safe one. So that we call a minority attack. We've got 2 white pawns trying to take on this mob of black pawns over here. And so this is called a minority attack, and that's one of white's plans in the Karlsbad pawn structure. Another plan that white can go for here is to say, well, I know it's in the teeth of black's half-open file, but we've got a central majority here. We've got 2 pawns in the middle compared to black's 1. Perhaps we can take over the centre if we play moves like f3, e4, and make some mischief in the centre. If black swaps, we dominate the centre. If black doesn't swap, we might be able to push on and push black's pieces around a bit. A plan invented by the fertile strategic brain of Mikhail Botvinnik, and we'll have a look at that game in a while. And so this is another very popular plan. I mean, Garry Kasparov picked it up when he was world champion, and started to make it look like a forced win. But that's more Kasparov than the plan, I think. Lastly, the great genius of American chess of the late 1800s, Harry Nelson Pillsbury, played an attacking formation called the Pillsbury attack. He'd take his knight and pop it on e5. It's not a classic outpost, and a classic outpost for a knight is one where black can't chase it away. Now, black can chase it away with a move like f6, but f6 might not be legal if there's a knight on f6, and it might not be desirable if you're weakening the king side. So that's not a bad place to plonk a white knight. And followed it up with grabbing some space on the king side with f2 to f4. With these 2 elements in place, let me just take out that move there for black. So with these 2 elements in place, we've got this very solid, very strong setup in the middle. 3 pawns set up in a little wedge formation supporting a knight on e5. And behind that very strong central wedge, white's going to feed pieces over towards the king side and try and checkmate black. And Pillsbury often used to face this, used to try this when his opponents were maybe playing some rather slow plans as black, with a queenside fianchetto, with the black bishop that was in c8 moving to b7, and really they're not having a lot of influence over the king side, and made it look very effective, and certainly it was. But one of the discoveries that have been made is that actually you can play the same plan in exchange variation, the Karlsbad structure, even while the bishop's still on c8 and has still some say about what's going on the king side. It's still quite an effective attacking plan, and again we'll have a look at that. So 3 plans for white, and really black has to be prepared for all of them or some combination of them. And but the person dictating the course of the game and choosing the plans here is white, and this explains one of the very the great popularity of these plans for white. I just made a list of all the repertoire books that recommend playing the Queen's Gambit in one form or another for white, and well over half of them recommended that you play the exchange variation and the form with f3. The knight goes to g. The knight on g goes to e2. So this plan with f3 and knight ge2. More than half of them recommended that this is how to play it. I mean, that's partly, as I say, Kasparov's advocacy of this approach to the position, but I think it's also a very practical way to play. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we start to look at some of the other examples.